Hey, I'm so excited to tell you about my December reads. I have a couple of really amazing ones, and if you're curious about a specific book, timestamps are in the description. I've actually been really sick since about December 20th. Today is January 11th. I had bacterial pink eye in both eyes. I had a really sore throat, lost my voice. I had fever, runny nose, all that stuff. It wasn't the plague, but it was still pretty bad. I'm finishing up a course of antibiotics now, but I think I'm finally well enough to film, and I'm so excited to tell you about the books that I read in December because they were so good. They were so good. So let's dive into it. Let's do it. Let's make it happen. This was the first book that I finished in December, and Last Night in Montreal by Emily St. John Mandel has been on my physical TBR, I think for several years now. I think I even bought this before the pandemic, maybe. And now that I've lived in Montreal for a few years, I'm like, okay, I really need to read this. So how do I describe this amazing book? Okay, so it follows a trio of characters, and one of them is incapable of setting down roots anywhere. So our lead character, she tends to just move all the time, every few months, so she doesn't form long-term relationships. And she's actually been on the move since she was a young child, kidnapped by her father, and they were constantly on the move, changing their identities so that she didn't get caught. And there's some hints that the kidnapping was somewhat legitimate slash for her own good throughout the book, which raises some questions. Largely, the book is actually set in the US, but we do have a few of our other characters either living or traveling to Montreal from the US and back. So really it follows this girl who never wants to be found, and all the people that are entranced by her story. It follows one of her ex-boyfriends who tries to find her after she suddenly leaves. It follows the private investigator who's been on her tail for decades, and his daughter who he neglected in favor of pursuing this mystery girl. So the writing is absolutely exquisite. I think Emily St. John Mandel does not like Montreal. She described the cold of Montreal so much, and I've been really trying to love this city in the winter and in the cold. Getting sick put a damper on that, but I've been really trying to go outside, enjoy the snow, and love winter. So this book did not help with that because the descriptions are so Montreal is freezing all the time, and it's yeah, I mean between November and March, yeah, basically. It's a beautiful book. It's just like a slice of life. It's a little bit like John Green's Paper Towns, but a sad lit fic for adults. So if that sounds like something that you would be down to read, I really recommend it. It's not very long, and it's really beautiful. I listened to it mostly on audiobook, and the audio production is also absolutely lovely. So 4 stars, I do recommend this. I next finished reading all of the available chapters I could find of the manga Blood on the Tracks. Whew. Okay, so I read this manga because I saw a YouTube video about how it's one of the most scary mangas ever written, because the kind of major tenet of this manga is that mothers can do terrible things and have emotionally inappropriate relationships with their children that potentially cause them to do terrible things to other people around them. It follows very dysfunctional families. I don't want to spoil the premise too much. The manga's really good. I'd say it does get a little bit repetitive as it goes on, and it does get very dark. So while I did give it a 4-star rating, I wouldn't recommend it very widely to a lot of people, just because if you have kind of any unresolved issues that would make you freak out from the topic of the manga, I would stay away from it. So what catalyzes the story is actually a little boy and his cousin are hiking with their families, and the cousin mocks the little boy a little, and in retaliation the little boy's mother pushes the cousin off a cliff, and he doesn't die, but he does go into a coma. And the little boy sees this, and he and his mother now have this secret. And she's this smiling, gentle, lovely person, but they now have this secret. And she begins really controlling his life. So he's just he's late middle schooler, early high schooler. he tries to get into a relationship with a young girl from his class, and his mom gets very possessive and very controlling around that. And that's sort of the horror that occurs. And all of this occurs, I'd say, in the first or second volume, and then after that, it just sort of spirals further and further into deep dysfunction. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting manga to read. I haven't read a lot of manga in general, but I have been enjoying my journey through Junji Ito and horror manga, and I did quite like this one. So I would recommend it if you're looking for horror, but not if it might be too much. It might be too much for certain people. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. So the next book I read, I had such high hopes for, and that was The Icepick Surgeon. So this is a nonfiction book exploring basically terrible things done in the name of science. So it follows chronologically, starting mid-19th century to present day, people who have committed murder, treason, grave robbing, other various unethical things in the name of progress in science. I ended up being a little bit disappointed by this book. I did like the structure of it and sort of how it went both chronologically and sort of stuck to a theme, but I found a lot of the tales were things I was already familiar with, and sometimes when I would want more detail or more depth, there would be a footnote, and the footnote said, please listen to my podcast episode XYZ to learn more. And like, now that I'm a content creator, I understand wanting to plug your content, but there were a lot of plugs. A lot of plugs for The Disappearing Spoon, Sam Kean's podcast. I'm literally just like, I might as well listen to the podcast. That said, the book is written very well. It's very engaging. It's very easy to read, but it felt a little fluffy. It felt a little too pulpy. I ended up giving it only 3 stars because I expected more meat out of it. I expected more unknown stuff. Like, a lot of this just felt like common knowledge. Like, I didn't need to know more about like Tuskegee, for example, because I learned a lot about that in university already. I didn't need to know more about Byrne hair. I've seen the movie. Like, yeah, it was all right. It was all right. Is kind of what I'm trying to say. I would not recommend it, but like, maybe listen to his podcast instead. This book is basically, if you just want to listen to the man's podcast, I think that may be a better use of your time. So 3 stars for this one. And I finished another horror manga. So as I've been saying, I've been getting into Junji Ito, so I read The Liminal Zone. And he has this amazing afterword after this manga where he basically just said, I started writing this during the pandemic, how to break down Bon Appetit. That's like the energy of it, but I really liked it. The stories were weird. There was one about a woman who couldn't stop crying, like even after death. She just kept, like, the tears kept flowing, and I'm like, okay, that's a mood. There was another one about this very bizarre off-Christian cult and really creepy successive younger and younger wives, that kind of situation. Very gothic, very weird. And a couple of other stories that I don't want to spoil, but I really do recommend this. It's very good. If you enjoy his short stories, these deliver. I think he doesn't think he did a good job, which is kind of funny. He's very like, I don't know if it's any good, but they are good. They are good. I do recommend them. This was, I gave it a 5-star read, actually. I'd say it's like a 4.5. Going on 5 stars, but it's definitely, a couple of the stories were really memorable, and I had a really good time reading this. The next book is not one I would have picked up if it weren't for the amazing Goodreads Discord book club that I'm a part of. This was one of our book club picks for December, for which the theme was books about disability. So this book covers deafness and deaf culture, and I feel like I learned so much, but I also got an amazing story out of it. So the book is True Biz by Sara Nović, and True Biz follows teenagers at a high school for the deaf, as well as their hearing but CODA, Child of Deaf Adults. There we go. Hearing the CODA principle. And just sort of the dynamics that emerge for that. So the dynamics that emerge of, for example, being in a hearing family and being the only deaf child and being forced to wear an implant, for example, and not having your family want to learn sign language. Or conversely, being in a deaf family and suddenly having a hearing child be born. It also dealt with deaf adults who late in life might develop dementia. It had all these like different characters and really explored deafness in a way that I've never seen in fiction. It was really eye-opening for me. And I also talked a lot about like deaf myths and stuff. So the structure of the book was that it followed several characters, and now and again we would find out what the characters are learning in school about deaf culture. So we would get these really nice little snippets about either like understanding how facial expressions play a role in sign language, or talking about myths within deaf culture, but like myths and legends style myths, not like things people believe and should believe. So the one I really, really liked was the concept of Ith. So I'm going to spell it out so that it makes more sense. The way that Earth is centered around the ear, Ith is like an alternate planet that's centered around the eyes, and that we don't care as much about. Like it's basically an Earth where the default is to be deaf. And when the children get this assignment of like, what would that look like? What sort of accommodations would have to be made for hearing people? And so I thought that was really interesting. It's a great book exploring disability and deaf culture, and yeah, I just absolutely loved it. The characters were really memorable. They were really charming. They were also just teenagers. Like there was little like teenage romances and interpersonal dramas, and it's absolutely fantastic. Lastly about this book is I listened to it on audio, and what's amazing on audio is that since the author is deaf herself, she's not the one reading the book, but she is signing anytime the dialogue is signed. So now and again you're hearing things being signed as the dialogue's being read, and that really added a whole other dimension to the book and to the experience. It was really interesting to listen to a book about people who can't do that, right? But also to then experience it as like being very conscious of your ability to hear and how that's not everyone's experience. So I absolutely loved it. It definitely motivated me to brush up on my sign language a little bit. It's not very good. I'm not going to do it on camera, but I have kind of taken an additional interest. Like this book is very, it's amazing consciousness raising, I think. It should be celebrated. I gave it a raging 5 stars. It was phenomenal, and I really recommend you pick it up. This next one that I finished, I think I was sick by the time I was reading this. This is an amazing little fairy tale for adults. It's Remarkably Bright Creatures, and it follows an elderly widow who lost her son many decades ago. Mysteriously, he died in the sea. It follows a brilliant octopus who lives in a small, like, aquarium, like touristy aquarium, in a fictional town in the US. And it follows an insufferable young man in his 30s who cannot kind of get himself together. And it's the unlikely friendship between the three of them that helps them find themselves and each other. If you want that kind of fairy tale where parts of it are narrated by a brilliant octopus, I mean, I love him. His name is Marcellus, and he's amazing. And he is hilarious also, and very, very talented in so many ways. If that sounds up your alley, I really recommend it. And there's a lot of like fan family, there's a lot of like imperfection of humanity. It's very character driven. Our main character, the widow, she's so lovely, and just she wants to do her crossword puzzle every day, and she works at the aquarium as a cleaning lady, so she develops a very close relationship with the octopus because she's always like cleaning his tank, and then she starts to realize that now and again he leaves his tank because he's smart enough to unlock it. All these kinds of things, and just they develop a very lovely friendship. I really liked their dynamic. I really enjoyed reading about it. So this ended up being a 4-star read for me. So it wasn't like over the top. I thought it would be like really, really amazing. Like it was good. It was definitely good. I would definitely still recommend it, but I think it was a little bit too everything wrapped up neatly in a bow and very like an adult's fairy tale. It's a very comforting book, and I do recommend it if you need that kind of comfort. The found family comfort trope. This is a really good book for that. Okay, and next what I finished, I read this so slowly. I read this over the course of 3 weeks because it made me so sad, but it also like made me stop in awe, and I kept wanting to annotate it. And that book is The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Look at these tabs. There's so many tabs. I wanted to weep at this book. So I don't even know how to explain to you what this book is about because it's amazing and I feel like it's best experienced blind. But ultimately, it's a book about very imperfect people going through grief. So the premise of the story and sort of how we start out is we have a mother and her 11-year-old roughly son living a very modest life when suddenly the father, the husband, dies completely unexpectedly in a tragic, slightly comical accident. And then they have to figure out how to move on. But their lives are so different from the happy, idyllic lives that they used to lead, like the early romance days of the couple and taking care of the son when he was young and teaching him all about music and space and dinosaurs and all this like very idyllic late toddlerhood that's presented so achingly. Like this book, just so much ache comes out of it, and they're just mourning these days, and the mother is like so stressed and so scared, and she works as someone who combs through newspapers and clips things pertinent to a specific topic. But with the rise of technology, her job is becoming obsolete, so she's constantly struggling with the possibility of having reduced hours or being laid off, having to learn how to navigate new technology, all these kinds of things. In the meantime, her son starts hearing voices. He starts hearing objects talking, not necessarily to him, just like objects complaining. Like, for instance, the shoes are unhappy because they haven't been worn for a while and they're like crying about it. The window is upset because a bird flew into it and it didn't want to hurt the bird and it's really upset. And all these voices are so loud in his head that he can't really deal with it. And he gets a tentative diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, spends some time in a psychiatric institute for children where he meets a couple of other characters who will then come in through the book. And what was really interesting with how this was treated was that there was implications of this both being an actual mental health crisis as well as magic realism. And the book never fully kind of goes one way or another, but does treat the topic extremely respectfully. I found that honestly very masterful. Very, very masterful in how Ruth Ozeki wrote it. And so we follow these characters over the years, how they're kind of trying to cope with grief and poverty and loss and hearing voices and having a child who hears voices and figuring out ways to skip school because school is overwhelming and figuring out what to do when you find out that your child's been skipping school for 2 months and going to the library instead to hang out with random vagrants, one of them who has a ferret. She's awesome. We really like her. She was one of the best characters. Anyway, the writing in this is so beautiful and it left me so sad. And this book definitely has flaws. It definitely has a couple of things that make you go, really? Really? There's a character that's basically Marie Kondo, but like she's not called Marie Kondo, but like helps the mother who struggles with hoarding. Her book inspires the mother to try and unhoard some of her stuff. She's a very entertaining character. And it kind of like loses the plot a little bit, but this book is still so beautiful and just resonated with my heart so much. This was my first Ruth Ozeki. It will not be my last. This was a resounding 5 stars, best book of the month, one of my top books of the year. This is so, so good. I'm so glad this won the Women's Prize this year, and I can't wait to read more of her work. Yeah, that's going to be really exciting, actually. So I'm pretty sure that that was one of my 5-star predictions in my TBR video. And another one of my 5-star predictions was this book, The Actual Star. And what I actually ended up giving this book was only 1 actual star. Just one. Just one. I finished this book by some bizarre miracle because... Okay. So when I first started reading this book, I really thought it would be a 5-star read. I had such high expectations. The Actual Star is set in 1012, 2012, and 3012. In 1012, we follow Mayan twins who are ruling part of the Mayan Empire, and their younger sister who is seeing visions of a jaguar god. In present day, or 2012, we're following a young girl, Leah, who is half Mayan, raised in the States, and who wants to go to Belize to explore Mayan ruins and reunite with that part of herself. And she meets these twins who are both tour guides in 2 different tour companies, and who are kind of like friendly but rival brothers. And then in 3012, we follow is the first problem. Okay, so we follow a couple of different people named viajeras. So they're travelers, and they're travelers who are questioning whether people who disappeared on Earth, starting with Leah from 2012, actually reached, the Mayan heaven. I forget the name for the Mayan heaven, but basically actually reached Mayan heaven. So their whole 3012, the way it's set up is that we're several hundred years after a climate apocalypse. There are not a lot of humans around. I think we're at like 9 million humans. And we have transcended everything. We have transcended race. We have transcended sex. Everyone has all reproductory organs. Everyone can choose their race and personality, which is called a manera. Individualism has completely collapsed, and the structure of the society is very, what I found kind of strange. So, for example, you can only spend time with any other person, including your biological children, for 9 days at a time. So you're not meant to form any sort of close human bonds because you're supposed to be closely bonded with everybody. And that's to mimic the 9 days that Saint Leah, so Leah from 2012, her 9-day journey when she went to Belize. So she is sort of like one of the foundational cornerstones of the religion. So it's like, okay, I'm like willing to start to entertain that. I wasn't too into this plot, as you can probably tell from the way I'm talking, but it just falls apart as we keep going. Okay, so when I thought this would be a 5-star book, I really expected there to be echoes of past and present bleeding into each other, and we do see that. And I also expected the writing to be quite good, and the writing is really good. It's really evocative. There's these really beautiful scenes, especially when there's the jaguar sightings in all 3 timelines. The scenes are incredible. The writing is gorgeous, and it pained me to give this book 1 star when the writing is so gorgeous. I'm looking at my review because my review sort of talks about how my star rating started going down. I started thinking 4 stars because as we kept going, it's clear that the twins, right, there's twin viajeras, but they don't know that they're twins in 3012. So it starts becoming clear that the Mayan twins, the present day tour guide twins, and the twin viajeras in 3012 are all reincarnations of the same soul. However, they weren't distinct enough personality-wise for me to pick up who was who, and only towards the very end of the book did I realize, oh, one of them always has a J in their name, one of them always has an X in their name. I wished I would have clued into that earlier, but okay, not the end of the world, but just in general, the characters didn't feel very well defined. None of the main characters felt well defined. And this was really frustrating. So I felt like I was reading for plot rather than characters, which is fine. This is going to be more of a 4-star read. And then things started getting repetitive. I started thinking, okay, maybe a 3-star read. There were a lot of very uncomfortable like raunchy scenes, and they were just written in this really like uncomfortable, bizarre way. There were a lot of also very graphic depictions of self-harm in all three timelines, like a lot of depictions of what was sometimes referred to as bloodletting, but wasn't always for the purposes of the bloodletting. There was a content warning for this in the author's note before the book, but it was still very graphic. So between that and the very like overwritten, kind of bizarre, spicy scenes, my rating started going down because I was just not enjoying the experience of reading the book. And then I started thinking more about what was happening in 3012, and the more I found out about the world, the more it bothered me. So one reason I don't read high fantasy very much is I hate having to learn a whole new environment, like a whole new vocabulary just to read a 400-page book. I don't like being faced with a lot of like names that are unpronounceable on purpose, like just a slide of consonants and things like that. And here there was this whole structure and this whole series of stuff that not only did I keep needing to like flip back to the glossary, which was several pages long, but also it just consistently like stopped making sense and seemed very bizarre. So this future world, they worship Leah, our modern day protagonist, who frankly doesn't do anything worth being worshipped for. It's a very, like, she is called Saint Leah, but there's no reason for her sainthood, other than she's the first person who disappeared. This is not a spoiler, it's sort of alluded to throughout the book. Gosh, it was just it was the most bizarre experience. And then the sacred texts are the scribbles of her tour guide from the evening before, after he had slept with Leah. Like, those are not sacred texts. What does that even mean? And then, of course, there was the whole 9-day thing. You can't spend more than 9 days with anyone at any given point in time. That was weird. And then there was this panopticon, so everyone's living with augmented reality, and everyone's actions are recorded, and you can always go and see what someone else did, only they will also know that you saw that. And this is presented as a very utopian ideal. Now, I know I've been talking about this book a lot, but just like, it's a very bizarre social structure that would fall apart immediately. Like, there's this really high-tech technology, but also you're not allowed to remain in any place for longer than 9 days. In fact, people who remain stationary, like have a house, are referred to as hoarders, and they are shunned from the rest of society. It is not okay to have a permanent dwelling. You have to be always traveling. But there's this really high-tech technology and like agriculture. Like, I just don't. I just don't. So it completely lost me. And that's really why I ended up giving it 1 star, is it just started falling apart the more I thought of it. And then as the plot progressed, the stories didn't bleed into each other in any way that was like interesting or coherent. The narratives do kind of collapse together. But it didn't wow me at all. It mostly just made me go, what? And it was such a disappointment because I started off absolutely loving this book, and at the end I feel like I read it so that you don't have to. I can't recommend this book to anybody. The writing's beautiful, the author is extremely talented, but it went off the rails and outside of its own logic. Yeah, 1 star. 1 actual star for the actual star. So this was thankfully kind of countered by a 5-star read, which was Ed Yong's I Contain Multitudes, and I loved it. This is a nonfiction book about the microbiome. So both the bacteria that live in our gut, the human gut microbiome, which is what I studied during my PhD, as well as the bacteria that live on us. So for example, in our skin, on our skin, in our mouths, etc. And bacteria that live in soil, bacteria that live in animals. How do they interact with us? That is the real question, and Ed Yong provides a really amazing overview. That's an incredible primer into microbiome science. I think he made it really accessible while being very exact, which is something that I really like about his writing. I listened to the audiobook of this, and I couldn't put it down, and it made me so excited about science. I've been so burned out post-PhD, but I'm slowly kind of coming out of that, and this book just reminded me how much I love the microbiome, how much I love the idea of, all us having these little ecosystems that are helping us and influencing us and supporting our health or not, and all these other things. It was a very good reminder of all these things that I learned and spent a lot of time working on professionally. And I would just recommend it really widely. If you're at all interested in the microbiome and don't know where to start, this is a great place to start. This is actually where I would say you should start, because yes, it talks about human health, but it also gives you a general overview and gives you a sense of what we know about the importance of bacteria. Why are these little critters that we can't see, that have one cell, that, like, what is it about them that's so incredible? And they do so many things and have so many cool properties. And I did not appreciate it in first year biology when I took that class a decade ago. It's been a decade. It's first year biology. I hated bacteria. I thought they were really boring. I thought vertical gene transmission was very boring. Not my thing. If my PhD supervisor is watching this, no, you're not. I absolutely hated bacteria. I didn't want anything to do with them, and now I think they are some of the coolest things ever. So if you don't think bacteria are cool, but are willing to change your mind, Ed Yong's the man to change your mind. 5 stars. I then finished a comic that I had an advanced reader's copy of. So this is a Spanish comic that has recently been translated into English and will be coming out in the upcoming months. I don't remember when, so I'll drop the date down below. It's called Ashes. It's the story of a road trip where 3 friends have the ashes of a 4th, and this 4th friend has asked them to spread his ashes in a particular spot. So these 3 friends haven't seen each other in a while. They go on a road trip, they catch up. The road trip turns funky. There's a monkey with them on their road trip. One of the friends has a monkey. They have a lot of unresolved historical stuff that they bring to light, but also a hostage situation occurs. And there's also these really comical villains who are like twins, both called Smirnov, which made me chuckle. But eventually all is well. And it's really just this story of friendship and the story of a monkey and ashes. And now and again there's these like 1-page interjections about either like the history of cremation or an insight into the past of one of the characters. Like we see the monkey's past life and stuff like that. Not like literally past life, just like what the monkey was up to a couple of years before it joined the crew. It didn't really end up being up my alley. I kind of had to force myself to finish it just because like the humor was not exactly my brand of humor, and I kept kind of like losing focus while reading this. I would, however, recommend it if you find anything what I said like funny, because it is if that is your brand of humor, this book is really, really good, and it is really highly rated in Spain. But it just didn't sit well with me, so I only gave it 2 stars, and I felt really bad about that. But honest ratings are what we're after, I guess. Honest ratings are the way to go. Okay, so for the last one, the last book of the year, the last book of December, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, also known as Tomorrow 3 or Tomorrow Cubed. Don't be mad, I only gave it 4 stars. When it comes to video games, this book is awesome. The video games describe... Okay, so let me talk about what the book is about. That would probably help. This book follows 2 friends, Sadie and Sam, who meet when they're children. They meet in like a children's playroom in a hospital, and they play video games together, and then they reunite as adults and start working on video games and become part of their own video game development company. That also includes Sam's roommate, Marks, who becomes kind of the 3rd important character in the story. So we follow their careers and ultimately their lives. And what was really cool about this book is that the structure of the book reflected the games they were currently developing. So, for example, there's a section called Both Sides, where we keep alternating between Sadie's perspective and Sam's perspective. And at the same time, they're working on a game that alternates between a medieval fantasy and reality, and it's the same character. So we're kind of like foot and Sadie's working on one part, Sam's working on the other. So it sort of like mirrors the structure of that. There's another section called the NPC where it's being narrated as if you were an NPC or non-playable character in a video game. So all this kind of stuff happens. Like the writing is really, really cool. The structure of the book is really cool and it's very readable. A lot happens. The characters have a lot of rich history. Their relationships evolve in these very dramatic ways. And the book at its core is not just about video games, but about human relationships. What I didn't like about it is that the human relationships reminded me a lot of Sally Rooney style relationships. Where really, I just want to take the two people and be like, listen, you keep having this very on again, off again dynamic. You seem very unhappy. You don't seem good for each other. Like, take a break. Walk away, take a break from each other. But they never do. And I didn't love that dynamic. I didn't find the dynamics that great. I think I was wanting something more. I was hungrier for something a little more. I don't know. I was hungrier for something more in the dynamics, and it left me feeling exactly how I felt after reading Normal People or A Beautiful World, Where Are You? Which I think are both excellent books, but just the way people relate to each other doesn't really mimic the way I relate to people. So I find it a little bit foreign, the way relationships are portrayed. And I found this to be the case in Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow as well. So if you do like Sally Rooney, or if you like video games, or if you like really good prose, this is a really good book. There's a reason people are talking about this book so much. It is really good, and the cover is really cool. And what is honestly the selling point of this book for me, and that it should be for you, is that it's like genre defying. The writing changes depending on the era we're in with the characters, like, again, depending on the game that they're making, depending how old they are, the structure of the book changes, and I think that's done so cleverly and is so interesting that for that alone, I would recommend this book. And I did end up giving it 4 stars. I did want a little something more from the relationships between the characters, but otherwise this was an absolutely pleasant read and a great way to end my 2022 reading year. Okay, so those were all my December reads. That is the most I've talked in like 3 weeks straight. Today's the first day my throat hasn't hurt in a while. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening to my December reads, and I hope you read a super good book sometime soon. All right, have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.